All right, we will get started. I'd like to call to order the Committee of the Whole for June 2022, at 7 p.m. First order of business is Pledge of Allegiance. Please rise. I pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. We will move on to roll call.
Alder Allen. Seems to be absent. Arata Frada. Yeah. Gerhart. Here. Herbst.
Here.
Maldonado. Appears to be absent. Richardson.
Here.
Strassman.
Here.
Udell.
Here.
Wheeler.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Very good. Thank you. Next item, approval of minutes. Do I have a motion to approve the May 25th, 2022 draft minutes?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a seconded discussion. Hearing none, we'll place the motion before us to a vote. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. The ayes have it. Motion carries. Moving on to the next item, public appearances for non-agenda items. I don't believe we have anyone on Zoom or in chambers. Then we will move to item 6, agenda items. The first item up is the 2022 Financial Management Plan. Greg Johnson from Ellers will present. And is there any words first from our Director of Finance, Misty Dodge?
I can, sure. So this is the next step of our capital improvement plan process, as well as a kickoff to the budget. So Greg is here to present on our financial management plan, which is a prospective look on our financials. He's been with Ellers for a while, worked with us for a while. These are really good partners with us to make sure that we are doing the best that we can from a financial perspective. So I'm going to ultimately keep pretty quiet unless there's questions. This is your chance to hear directly from Greg based on his expertise.
Very good. Thank you, Misty. Greg, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here again with you to go through the financial management plan. Misty gave a nice introduction in terms of the purpose of tonight's discussion. There's several areas that we'll cover. We'll review some of the key financial metrics that the city has established in its financial policies to make sure that the city still maintains in compliance with those, the guidelines within those policies. We'll also illustrate a long-range multi-year forecast that looks at the city's primary levy funds, your general fund, which funds the balance of your operations, your Fitchburg area community TV, library fund, capital projects, and debt service, all of the components of the city's property tax levy. We've done a multi-year projection that looks at the trends for each component of your levy. We'll provide kind of a general assessment of your current financial strengths and some of the challenges that you're facing. And as Missy stated, this really serves as a framework for kickoff of the 2023 budget by taking really a multi-year look at the city's long-term financial trends. So this is really kind of an all-in financial model, kind of identifies operational costs that the city staff has identified long-term, and also includes full funding of the capital improvement plan as it stands presently. So this really is able to kind of take that broad look at all aspects of your budget in terms of both operations and capital. The city has been rated by Moody's Investor Services for several years. The city enjoys a AA1 rating from Moody's, which is excellent. Some of the credit strengths that they've identified over the years is the city's proactive budget management. This long-range forecast is something that they, always give credit to the city for undertaking each year, that you're not looking at a budget in just a 12-month context, but looking at your needs over a multi-year horizon. And then the city's strong fund balance and general liquidity. Fund balance is generally, and we'll talk about that more here this evening, but that refers to, kind of your unassigned funds, kind of your rainy day amount that is set aside for unseen financial developments or emergencies. And the city has always enjoyed a very strong fund balance. Your expanding tax base, the city has seen steady growth over the past couple of years. That's noted as a financial credit to the city's overall profile as well. Some of the challenges that have been identified by Moody's, which we've discussed here before, we'll talk a little bit more in depth on this tonight as well, is all communities in Wisconsin are under levy limit constraints. And so we're going to talk about that specifically in terms of the city of Fitchburg's levy limit challenges, but they note that that's kind of a constraint in terms of your ability to increase the levy as a primary revenue source. They've noted, the city has an above-average debt burden. That's a fairly common distinction that's made amongst Wisconsin communities that is partially due to levy limits. Any funds that you borrow for capital projects on a general obligation basis are exempted from levy limits. And so communities, since they don't have as much flexibility to increase the levy to pay for items with cash, broadly speaking, communities maybe are borrowing more than they would historically have or would prefer to because of levy limits, so that debt burden is a little bit higher. But they do note that the city's pension burden is moderate through WRS. So largely speaking, Moody's always has very positive things to say about the city's financial management, your economic development and tax base, and just your ability to exercise consistent, strong financial management. There are several financial policies that the city has in place. There's typically three that we kind of focus on in this presentation. One is your general fund balance, which I just mentioned, Moody's notes as a credit strength. Looking at your debt service expenditures as a % of your operating budget, and then making sure your projected debt service tax rate is within the range identified in your policy, and your debt capacity, which refers to the limit and the amount of debt that you can have outstanding under state law, making sure you're within the guidelines that have been established as well. So we'll start with fund balance. The city has a fund balance policy that the general fund unassigned fund balance is at least between 15 to 25% of revenues. So we show a kind of a 10-year look here in terms of where that fund balance has stood, and look at the percentages of your unassigned fund balance as a % of total revenue. So you can see going back over a number of years, you've remained within that target range or exceeded it. We've noted a few of the years down below where there were some particular items that kind of drove that fund balance, down lower in those fiscal years, but then it kind of went, grew and went back up. And so this is, something that the city has, fairly direct control over from a financial standpoint, which is one of the reasons that it's, one of the, key financial indicators that the rating agencies look at, because it is something within your direct control. So the city has had, very healthy fund balance, kind of above your policy level, but that has been something that, has been noted for years as one of your predominant fiscal strengths.
Yes, go ahead.
Just to clarify on the bottom, that percentage at the bottom, is that the percentage of unassigned fund balance? Because I see that the bar includes, assigned and non-spendable.
Yes, that's the percentage of unassigned fund balances total. And then the graph just breaks down all the components of the fund balance, but the percentage is the unassigned fund balance as a % of revenues.
Great, thanks.
Additional questions before we move on? I see none. Go ahead, Greg.
Next policy looks at your total debt service expense. Your policy target is that your gross general obligation debt service expense would be between 15 to 25% of total general fund, library, and debt service expenses combined. So we show where you've been the last couple of years and how that's trending going forward, even with full borrowings for the CIP as it stands presently. So you've remained within the kind of the middle point of the target range of this policy as well. You'll note that in 2021 it was higher, but that's because your total debt expenditures include paying off and retiring principal outstanding related to TID District number 4. So you spent more on debt, but you paid debt off early to incur savings. And then there was also refunding of prior debt that was paid off and refinanced to take advantages of lower interest rates. So while your true expenditures for debt service were up. It was related to really saving money, paying debt off early with TID funds and refinancing debt. So there was an expense to pay off those prior bonds, but you're saving money in the long term. So again, even with the capital improvement borrowings that I'll touch on later in the presentation, you're staying right around that 20% range, which is right in the middle of your policy target.
Looking at that chart, how is inflation factored in? This chart, I assume, is what we, this is what we borrow on that day. It's our present value. What we end up paying is substantially more. I'm more interested, and we show this, we're doing well, but, what the total cost is, or inflation gets factored in, I seem like that's getting lost or missed somewhere, especially as we're moving into, higher borrowing costs.
So the kind of the expenditure is really based on gross principal and interest, over this planning horizon out till 2032. So we're projecting, kind of increasing interest rates throughout this present environment. So we are anticipating that borrowing costs, to be conservative, would go up over this planning period. And then, your capital project list is also kind of adjusting in the future for those changes in inflation and costs as well. So we are factoring in higher interest rates and, adjustments in those borrowing amounts going forward. So it is taking that into account.
Thank you.
Additional questions? No, hearing none.
So finally, in terms of some of your financial targets, we'll talk about the tax rate for debt service. Your policy is that it will not exceed $2.25 per thousand. If we look at kind of the 10-year horizon in this planning model, the average tax rate for debt service is $1.13 per thousand. That's down about 10 cents from the same 10-year forecast that we had presented last year. And then GO debt capacity. Under state law, the amount of principal of general obligation debt that the city can have outstanding cannot exceed 5% of the city's total equalized value. So of that limit, the city's policy is that you will not exceed 60% of your statutory debt limit. So the maximum utilization in this plan with full financing of the capital projects identified to be funded through borrowing in the 10-year capital improvement plan, that maximum debt utilization is 36%. When we had the same 10-year plan that we presented last year, the maximum utilization was 39%. So some slight movement downward in both of these targets in terms of tax rate for debt service and your general obligation borrowing capacity. And again, this kind of includes full funding of the CIP plan as it exists presently.
Alder Gerhart, go ahead.
Going back a little bit to the Moody's analysis, so one of our, the high debt burden was one of the cons. How do we, and obviously that's just a function of it, we live in Wisconsin. Are we in good shape compared to other municipalities? Do you evaluate that at all?
We do. You are in good shape compared to other communities. And I think, as we'll talk about here in the presentation, the city uses a combination of funding techniques to fund your capital improvements. You're funding as much as you can, through your property tax levy and still being mindful of levy limits. And, what you're borrowing for is certainly, larger, ticket capital items, infrastructure, facility improvements, and things of that nature. So, in my opinion, the city's using borrowing for those types of projects that are appropriate, and you're using cash and levy sources to fund things, to avoid borrowing. So, when you're looking at some of the items that are in your long-range capital plan, particularly in terms of, some larger facility potential improvements, practically speaking, you really have no other way to finance that other than debt. So I think when we present all this information to Moody's, we're giving them that same context, that they see what you're doing to kind of limit borrowing and what you're borrowing for, or, kind of that core infrastructure and facility investment. So that's part of the discussion as well, is what is the context and what are you borrowing for?
All right, thanks.
Yes, Alder Herbst. Go ahead.
One last question, excuse my ignorance, but the target, not to exceed 2.25 per thousand, this may be directed more to Misty. our property value, assessments are going way up. So are we trying, if they go way up, are we lowering that number, or are we just saying, all right, now I'm gonna take more out of all the residents' pockets to finance our plans?
So first I'd say this is not a target, it's a policy, right? So it's a cap. Obviously, our goal would be to be less than that. But you're right, the increasing values is a big part of these numbers because it's based on that equalized value. And I think is probably a big reason why it dropped a little bit was because of the growth in our equalized value. We know things are being built, we know values are going up, and it is that kind of calculation that factors that in. So I think you're right on as far as why that's changing a little bit. But that'd be a good reason to keep it a little bit lower on that policy side too, not a target. I also, if I can add one more thing.
Go ahead.
Because I've seen some people writing down statistics. So the presentation was not included in the packet, but I will be posting it on the city's website tomorrow. So you'll have that for a reference then.
Perfect, thank you. Additional questions? Seeing none. Go ahead, Greg.
Well, next we'll kind of talk about those valuation projections and, what we're incorporating into the model. So we're going to start by talking about kind of the TID-out valuation projection. So the Department of Revenue certifies, two types of valuations each year for communities. The TID-in value, which is all the taxable property value within the city, and that is the value that your borrowing limit is based off of. But for really all of our tax rate projections, we focus on what we call the TID-out valuation, because that's really more representative of the value that you're using to fund your general fund, your capital levy, and your debt service levy. When the TID districts close, and I'll give an illustration of that here in a moment, that value goes back onto the tax rolls and goes in, into these projections. So just to explain our methodology, we try to be conservative when we do these growth projections. Up at the top here of the screen is just kind of the 5-year trend of the city's growth and its equalized value. And the Department of Revenue kind of allocates and breaks down that growth into kind of 3 categories. What's due to economic change, what's due to new construction activity within the community, and then there's kind of a catch-all category for everything else, prior year adjustments, and personal property as well. So we kind of look at that average change over the past several years by each of those categories. And then we apply some discount factors to kind of, be more conservative with our projections. So for economic change, we're taking that 5-year average and discounting it by 50%. So we're showing that economic change growth is just going to be under 2%. For new construction, it's approximately 3%. And then we factored in other adjustments that are kind of one-time factors that are going to be impacting your TID-out equalized value. So for the 2023 budget, there's 2 of those kind of one-time factors that are impacting the budget for next year. One is the value that the city will absorb from its portion of the town of Madison. And then the second factor is the city closed tax incremental district number 6. And so all of that incremental value is going to return to the tax rolls. So the estimated impact of both of those items combined is an additional $209 million of value coming back onto the tax rolls for the 2023 budget. Similarly, it's anticipated that TID District number 4 will close this coming year, and so that will impact the 2024 budget. The current incremental value for that district is about $220 million. So really over the course of the next 2 budget cycles, the city is seeing some significant value kind of return to the tax rolls, largely due to closure of the city's 2 largest TIF districts. So kind of that long-term investment and partnership with the other taxing jurisdictions for those TIF districts is starting to come to fruition. So we kind of isolate those because they are kind of one-time events that kind of impact your valuation projections. So that's why the total TID-out equalized value is seeing very healthy increases, particularly the next 2 years. But you're seeing the benefit of those TID closures. So that's good news to report.
Yes, go ahead, Alder Gerhart.
Thank you. I'm just curious and maybe this isn't significant enough, but we were going to consider adding a new TID. Was that known to Ellers? Is that a part of your calculations, or is that doesn't factor in until it's done?
It doesn't really factor in until it's done. So in terms of, that creation of that TIF district, the initial value of property that's within that TIF district is going to remain part of these TID out calculations. As new incremental value, hopefully occurs within that district, you'll see the benefit of that value in the future when the TIDs close.
Okay, thanks.
Additional questions? Go ahead, Greg.
So next I'll speak to kind of the methodology that we work with on staff to kind of do the operating projections. We're going to focus on your operating funds here for the next few minutes. Typically we again try to employ a conservative adjustment, and Misty's very helpful in kind of providing some guidance on the operating projections. It's very much a team effort. So really most of the non-levy revenue sources that the city has within its general fund budget, we're not really forecasting significant changes to those revenue sources, kind of keeping them consistent where they've been in current budget cycles. State shared revenue are forecasting some increases in state shared revenue, about $651,000 per year through the planning model. And then we are forecasting some increases in road aids also received from the state. That road aid revenue is about $2.1 million per year from 2023 to 2032. So your revenue stream is very typical of what you see in Wisconsin municipalities. Some non-levy revenue sources, but communities in Wisconsin are property tax heavy reliant. That's the typical funding mix. And then you have some intergovernmental aid revenues that you receive from the state. I mean, those two revenue sources, that's what's driving your operating budget really from year to year. So that's pretty consistent. In terms of the expenditure methodology, trying to be conservative here as well. Most of your departments that are primarily wage driven, we kind of show expenditures increasing by about 5% per year. Other expenditures in other areas that are less labor intensive, showing those increasing by about 3 to 4% per year. And then allowances are added within the operating projection to reflect additional staffing costs that are related to the impact of the capital improvement plan only. So it kind of incorporates increasing costs for existing expenditures and some existing staffing costs related to the capital improvement plan.
I have a question regarding several percentages of different values of increase. What does that do in a year like today when they speak of 8.6% inflation? I mean, what does that do to the numbers that you have up on the screen? Or what does it do to the numbers for next year?
Yeah, I think, we're going to that's going to be kind of a theme as we kind of go through this presentation. So
Sure.
Obviously we're in kind of a period of very high increasing costs. So you're seeing maybe some increased pressure on the expenditure side, but the revenue constraints that you're operating under are still going to be very consistent with what the city has experienced for the past couple of years. So I would say the positive news is there's some, you're getting some benefit from your levy limit due to the TID closures. You get a one-time levy limit increase in the year of a TID closure that can increase your allowable levy. So that's a benefiting factor. And then you're also seeing that healthy increase in your value that can impact the tax rate. So, I think what's going on presently, I mean, everyone's aware of it. You can't, read a paper or watch the news without hearing about it. But I think in terms of, are these costs at this level going to be sustained over a 10-year planning horizon? I think that, a lot has to, I think unfold for that to really, I think, hold true. And I think if that is the case, there's going to be some, fundamental pressures really put on all municipalities to keep up with that pace, particularly under levy limits. And we'll kind of touch on that here from a policy context as we continue.
Very good. Thank you. Additional questions? Go ahead, Greg.
So in terms of just the general fund summary, this is just kind of a high-level forecast of all of your primary revenue sources and then your expenditures by, kind of service area, and just, projects a balanced budget for the general fund over, the next 10 years. So you'll see kind of how those, that average change in expenditures within your general fund is kind of shown in the orange bar here across the page. So you'll see kind of, some kind of steady, consistent increase in general fund expenditures going forward. So trying to kind of build in some increase in cost. Certainly, this year with kind of what's going on may present some, more immediate short-term challenges, but I think long-term, still trying to kind of project cost, remaining within a reasonable range, to also take into consideration the levy impact to taxpayers as well. For the library fund, this is kind of consistent with how we've worked with staff to kind of forecast the library fund as well. This model kind of illustrates, the increase in the levy tied to the projected net new construction. These expenditures, don't necessarily consider the capital project costs that may be funded by equipment replacement or fund balance. This is more intended to kind of focus on the general operating costs that are funded in part through the property tax levy for the library as one of the key components of your overall property tax levy. So next, we're going to kind of talk about levy limits, because really, you can't kind of talk about a budget model without understanding and having some discussion about how levy limits impact that model. So just some general background information on the levy limits. So you're allowed to increase your allowable levy from the prior year by the percentage increase due to net new construction in the preceding year, or zero if there is none. There are numerous adjustments that you can make to increase your allowable levy above that net new construction. The most common one that's utilized here in Fitchburg and is utilized really by municipalities across the state is an adjustment for general obligation debt service. So any general obligation debt service that the city issues to finance capital projects is all legally backed by an irrepealable tax levy. If you need to increase your levy to make debt service payments, that is essentially exempted from the levy limits. So there's portions of your levy that are subject to this limit. The debt service levy is not. Whatever you need to increase your levy by to make debt service payments, you can still do so under levy limits. So let's talk about each of the components of the city's property tax levy. So the general fund is subject to that levy limit, that net new construction cap, as library, TV, and your capital levy. So all of that is subject to that net new construction limitation. So when we look at these total levy forecasts going forward and look at the projected levy limit impact, it's taking into account, all of those aspects, including the debt service. But again, the debt service is exempt from levy limits. So the bulk of what is funded through the city's property tax levy is subject to that limit under state law. So let's talk about some of the items in terms of kind of some key policy areas that are going to be impacting the 2023 budget. So there's levy limits, and then there's also what's called the expenditure restraint program. And the expenditure restraint program is an aid program from the state that if your expenditures from the prior year increase less than a specific percentage that is calculated for each community separately, you can receive some of that intergovernmental aid. So as part of the 2023 budget, the city is going to be seeing some increased costs, related to staffing related to the town of Madison and that absorption. So that's going to increase your expenditures over where they were prior years by, amounts that aren't necessarily reflective of how your expenditures have changed in years prior, because you kind of have this, unique impact of the absorption. So city staff worked with the Department of Revenue to try to essentially get an exemption to deduct a defined amount of those increase in costs. so it doesn't count towards the city's expenditure restraint limit. And that effort was successful. So kudos to your city staff and others for receiving that permission, because that's going to, help remain in compliance with expenditure restraint. But there's still, candidly, probably some work to be done on the levy limit side for that same expense. So while, if those costs are built into your budget and the DOR will allow you for this year to deduct some of those costs from your expenditure restraint cap, your primary revenue source to pay for those costs is your property tax levy. So similar relief, would be preferable on the levy limit side as well. They say you can increase your costs and it won't penalize you from expenditure restraint. Getting some additional relief to have an additional levy limit adjustment would be equally beneficial to kind of balance those two factors out. So that's, we've had conversations with staff about perhaps, the method to suggest to the DOR, and, I think those conversations will continue here in the near term. We're going to look at a couple of different levy limit scenarios, kind of what happens if that, additional allowable levy authority is granted under levy limits, and, and what happens if it is not, to kind of look at what that ongoing levy limit gap looks like, particularly how it impacts your general fund, library, and operating funds in your total levy. So we're going to start by just kind of taking a more narrower focus here in terms of kind of, some projections related to your levy for the 23 budget before we transition to the multi-year model. So in this, particular projection, we've kind of projected what's needed for your general fund levy, cable TV, the library, your capital projects, and then your existing debt service levy. In discussions with staff, it's at this present time, it seems unlikely the city will borrow any funds this year in 2022, which would normally hit the budget in 2023. So there's no new debt service forecasted for the 2023 budget. So kind of based on the methodology I've been discussing and all four aspects here of your levy for the operational side, then plus debt, the projected levy is about a little over 28 million, which is about a 4% increase over the year prior. But again, as a result of primarily of the closure of TID District Number 6 and some additional value that you're, taking on from the town of Madison, your TID out equalized value is projected to go up about 10%. So even if your levy in this illustration went up 4% from the prior year, your projected tax rate on an equalized basis is projected to go down. And so we show there, what a home of $330,000 would pay, what they've paid historically for the 2020, 21, and 22 budgets, and then what that would be for the 23 budget if that levy increase was about 4%. So seeing, that immediate impact primarily of the TID closure, that new value coming on, even though your levy is going up, the tax rate, could potentially decrease. So that's some positive news for 2023 in the near term. Just one note that, this doesn't include, allowance for, kind of future staffing kind of beyond what was accounted for with, the impact of the CIP. So that's not factored into this analysis at this time. So next I'm going to talk about levy limits and, just kind of how they would work depending on the adjustments that's available to the city. So what's illustrated here is just kind of a summation of the levy limit worksheet, but I'm going to highlight really kind of the key numbers that impact the calculation for this year. So I mentioned you get a one-time allowable increase in your levy limit the year following a TID closure. So it's estimated that the benefit of the TID 6 closure is you could increase your allowable levy by about $343,300. So that'll be pre-calculated and on the city's levy limit form. You'll likely claim that adjustment just because it's what we call a base building adjustment. It's advantageous to claim it. You may reduce other adjustments that you need on the worksheet, but there's no reason not to take that adjustment because it's advantageous to the city long term. It's estimated that the city will also be allowed to take on some of the prior level levy authority of the town of Madison. That's estimated at about $467,000. So those are kind of some one-time impacts to help your allowable levy under the levy limit calculation for the 23 budget. So I mentioned, that the DOR has allowed the city to exempt from expenditure restraint some of the increased costs related to the town of Madison absorption that equaled about $1,180,000. Hasn't been approved yet by the DOR to allow a portion of that or all of that to also be claimed on the levy limit worksheet to increase your allowable levy. But if it was, and this city wanted to know, well, what was its maximum allowable levy? We've calculated that here on the worksheet, and if your levy was at around that $28 million mark that we were projecting in the model, and you got that additional levy capacity from the DOR, you would still have additional levy capacity of about $620,000. So that kind of illustrates kind of the potential benefit of kind of having those ongoing discussions with the DOR to just kind of understand that you're, dealing with some, financial items with your 23 budget that, quite frankly, aren't typical. There's no pre-prescribed method under expenditure restraint or levy limits to deal with absorption for part of another community. That just doesn't happen on a regular basis. So we're kind of in uncharted territory. So I think it's been good that the DOR has been understanding that, there are some kind of one-time costs, and staff has been very good about isolating those and communicating that, we're just trying to identify some of these unique factors that are impacting 2023 in particular. So kind of to look at it, kind of more of a scenario that isn't as positive, I think, the TID closure adjustment for TID 6, that's going to be there. Likely the town of Madison carryover, that'll likely be there as well. How it fills into the calculation, I think, is still to be determined. But if the DOR doesn't, grant some additional allowable levy authority under levy limits for some of the town of Madison costs, and you have that levy of a little over $28 million, you'd actually have a levy limit shortfall of about $560,000. So that kind of illustrates kind of the importance of, again, kind of continuing that dialogue with the DOR to try to have some additional flexibility in your allowable levy under levy limits. Because without that, and if you just rely on kind of existing adjustments, projecting that gap of about $560,000. So, it's the levy limit worksheet, as we always say, it's kind of an art, not necessarily a science. Some of it is predetermined. How you use the adjustments vary from year to year, depending on your total levy and the adjustments available to you. So I think the key message here to reiterate on the levy limits is, I think how much flexibility will be granted to kind of absorb, have the levy authority take on some of those additional costs that are incorporated into the 23 budget.
Okay, we have a question. Alder Gerhart, go ahead.
I'm curious about so I guess two questions. Number one is City of Madison and Fitchburg, are we having those conversations together given the fact that we're both? Okay. And then number two, do we have any sort of potential timeline? Do we have any idea when we'll be able to get an answer, or is this going to be just, we're crossing our fingers it's before October?
Yeah, so I have my next meeting with the City of Madison on Friday. Okay. So we're going to come together to figure out what strategy we want to use to approach the Department of Revenue. We actually haven't approached them yet either. My guess is we'll approach them in the next couple of weeks. Okay. The expenditure restraint negotiation took a very long time. So I'm hopeful that we made some ground with that process, and so the levy limit conversation won't take as long. But it's all to be determined.
Great, thanks.
Additional questions? Yes, Alder Frada, go ahead.
So maybe for you, Mr. Greg, is what happens if we are in this scenario, where we have the deficit? We are going to use general fund to cover that, the strategy that you're going to use to cover the gap?
So remember how with the 2022 budget, we used abated debt to spend our TID 6 closure in our town of Madison levy limit adjustment early. We have that same opportunity as a one-time thing with the TID 4 closure. So that might bridge some of the gap, but that won't necessarily bridge a $600,000 gap. So, to be determined. We are hopeful that the Department of Revenue will work with us because this is very much so uncharted territory for all of us. We found a strategy or an option that will present to them that fits within the confines of the statute. We just have to convince them that it's a good idea.
Additional questions? Seeing none? Go ahead, Greg.
So next, we're going to kind of look at that multi-year budget forecast model. So again, incorporates all aspects of your levy that we've been talking about, and then also incorporates the capital improvement plan. So we've, estimated debt service out over the next several 10 years, incorporates all the projects that are currently identified for borrowing in the CIP. Some of the debt, is anticipated to be supported by TIF or special assessments or other revenues. So we're going to look at kind of that full impact in the budget model. So we'll talk about, just start with the debt. You'll be able to see this a little more clearly when you kind of look through the presentation in more detail, but this is just the existing tax levy for debt service. So if no other additional debt was issued, the debt service levy is kind of gradually projected to kind of go down and then kind of stabilize. This year, with no debt likely being issued in 2022, you'll actually see the debt service levy in next year's budget will actually be less. So that's been incorporated into the model. This just kind of illustrates the point I made that there are several non-levy revenue sources that you use to repay your debt service, mainly TIF revenue and some special assessments. So not all of the debt is repaid by the property tax levy, but the clear majority of it is. The chart that's in the presentation, this is just kind of our replication at Ellers of the table that you have in your capital improvement plan that identifies which projects are going to be financed through borrowing. So we've identified the year as it was laid out in your plan, which year the project would be funded. And for some of your capital items, we adjust the amortization period kind of based on the useful life. So for some of your equipment items, we're amortizing those over 5 years. Some of your smaller capital projects, we're amortizing within 10. Some of your other projects we're amortizing over 20. And then for TID projects, we're amortizing those projects within the maximum life of the district. So we kind of go through each project and kind of determine kind of an appropriate amortization term. But the project list is, again, just a replication of what you have in your current CIP, just kind of identifies the repayment source and which debt issue will be funded for each project. Probably the one change that we typically make is, in 2028, you had, a small amount of capital projects. We got a long ways to go between now and 2028, but, you wouldn't fund that small amount of projects as a standalone debt issue. So we rolled it into the 2027 financing just to kind of, consolidate the debt issues in the model. So let's kind of talk about, kind of the debt service, if everything that was identified in the capital improvement plan was funded, with future borrowings, what that would look like. And there's some, large facility projects that are identified in the next couple of years. So all of that's been factored into these calculations. So typically when we structure the debt service for budgeting purposes, we like to structure future debt payments so the levy change per year for debt service is fairly consistent. So you have a number that you can kind of rely on consistently within the budget so your debt service levy isn't fluctuating significantly. So the levy for debt service in this year's budget was about $4.5 million. Next year, that's projected to decrease by about $387,000, so a little over $4.1 million, because there's no new borrowing anticipated this year. So then we had all the future, debt issues modeled going out based on the CIP. And so we structured the debt service so that levy change per year just for debt is about $495,000 per year. We've kind of modeled financings out within the 10 years in your CIP. You see the levy then for existing and proposed debt would decrease again in 2032. That's the end of our planning model. So we kind of build in future decreases in debt service. So when we add the next year's year of debt service. In the model next year, we have that decrease kind of built in already. So that's very deliberate on our part. So again, this is based on full funding of everything that's in the CIP. So fully recognize that can change as you continue your conversations and discussions on priorities. But if all of that was fully funded, it's about a $495,000 impact to the levy each year throughout the planning model. So geodebt capacity, we talked about this in terms of kind of your policy, and you can see that at the beginning of this fiscal year, the end of 2021, the city was at 33% of its debt limit. Through this planning model, you're not, with everything fully funded in the CIP, you're not projected to get any higher than 36%. So from a borrowing limit perspective, you're still, very comparable to where you are presently. So to the extent that you need to borrow for the items that are identified in the plan for borrowing, at least in terms of your borrowing limit, we're not seeing a, substantial change in your direct debt burden. So that's a positive to the extent that you, may continue to use debt service for some of your, particularly your larger capital improvement projects. We've included kind of the multi-year projection model in terms of the total budget for operations and debt going all the way out till 2032, and then showing those, change in your equalized value going forward. So this just kind of shows how that tax rate is kind of projected to change going forward. So you'll see, over the next couple of years, we already talked about from 22 to 23, there's a potential for, the tax rate to decrease, largely due to the TIG closure, and, seeing some impact of that even potentially into 2024. And then, kind of the tax levy kind of stabilizing with some, some fluctuation as we get out farther in later years. So, I think in the projection model, trying to kind of, again, just this gives you kind of a long-range look at how the levy could change. A lot of assumptions built into this, as we've been talking about, in terms of what's going to happen, but this is kind of that all-in projection model that looks at kind of all of your needs, both on the operational and the capital side. So I want to note for 2023, we talked about if, some additional levy capacity can be obtained on the levy limit worksheet, and we had kind of identified that potentially, at most would likely be about 620,000 of additional levy capacity. That's not factored into this projection for 2023. So we're trying to be conservative and not count on that at this point in time. So again, I think in the near term, really seeing the benefit of those TIF district closures, which is a nice benefit for the city and for the other taxing jurisdictions too. We just include a graphic illustration that just kind of shows where the property tax levy is going. It's pretty consistent, really historically, and projected going forward. The bulk of your debt service or your levy, goes towards the general fund. The next kind of highest area is debt service, followed by library and TV. So just kind of shows that really there isn't, significant changes projected in how your levy dollars are directed within your budget. So next we want to kind of talk about levy limits, but talk about it in the context of how does this look based on those levy projections, over the next 10 years. And in this scenario, we've kind of, show that, what would happen if you get that additional levy adjustment. There's that additional, estimated 620,000 of potential additional levy capacity if the city chooses to use it. But then going forward, even if without that additional levy authority, we're projecting, some levy limit gaps going forward, kind of long term. This is not unusual. After 17 years of levy limits in Wisconsin, communities are starting to see, more pressure on their levies going forward. And so, the fact that there's some levy limit gaps isn't particularly unusual when we do this type of modeling for other communities. and even when we look at without that additional adjustment, there's, that gap is still kind of the same. It's more of just the extent of whether or not one exists for 2023 or not. So again, this is kind of an all-in kind of scenario that kind of looks at, kind of your levy limit challenges, but I think as you've successfully kind of mitigated some of that over the years. I think, the question really looking ahead is, are those mitigation strategies going to be successful and still enable you to kind of meet your expectations for service delivery and investment in capital? So some of those strategies that, that the city has successfully used and, encourage you to continue to have these strategic discussions that are part of your regular strategic budget process, looking at your overall tax levy and rate objectives, the impact on taxpayers, balancing that with any new services or other initiatives. Are there any decreases in services that, may be appropriate? Prioritizing your capital projects, trying to maximize that capital levy to the extent that you can to avoid borrowing. Looking at making sure that you have acceptable levels of debt financing and, maybe occasional use of fund balance if you get over some of your policy targets. So these are, just some of the kind of high-level strategic approaches that the city has, successfully been using in its budget over the years. I'm confident you'll continue to do so. But, if these strategies don't, accomplish the objectives at the end of the day, what other tools, are available to you under levy limits?
We have a question. Mayor Richardson, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is for Greg or Misty, but you did mention how we've done a pretty good job using different strategies to minimize the impact. So, because it could be a lot worse than this. Would this be one of the many examples of where the replacement fund cost funding is making a big impact, where we're kind of ahead of time putting funds towards replacement of different items? Would that be something that kind of falls into that part of the reason why? Because we know and have known and continue to I guess, plan for replacement of a lot of different things now. I'll let you speak to that, I guess, one of you.
So I think so. I think it's a great way to demonstrate our commitment to staying on course, right? Knowing what it will take if we do add additional facilities or to just maintain what we currently have. But I suspect you want to hear from Greg, because I know I love him, right? So it's probably good to hear from a third party.
Yeah, no, I think the strategy of kind of using replacement funds is an effective way to, kind of maintain that capital funding and, reduce reliance on debt. I think that's a good strategy. I mean, we recommend that to communities, that you kind of establish those sinking funds, because if you have years where you have a little more levy flexibility, you can kind of pre-fund those items and set aside that cash. So yes, that's a very good strategy, so that we would recommend that continue to the extent you can.
Alder Herbst, you have a question. Go ahead.
Glad you raised that point. I don't quite understand, though, we say, for instance, a fire engine, that we're putting aside the money to replace that engine. Are we collecting that from the taxpayers and setting it aside so we have it when we get to the end? Is that what we're doing?
Yes. So instead of, I guess there's two opposite ways you could do it. So let's say it's a 10-year piece of equipment. We will collect that money over the 10 years leading up to it, set it aside, invest it, and then at the point that it's needs to be replaced, we'll have the cash to be able to pay it instead of borrowing. The flip side of that, or the other way we could do it, is we could borrow for it at that point and then collect the cash from the 10 years of the use afterwards. So the true impact to your property owners is the difference between cash financing and getting interest money on it versus paying interest on that borrowed money. But it's the same 10 years worth of payments that we receive from
I
taxpayers.
like what's behind door A better. Okay, thank you.
Additional questions? Hearing none, go ahead, Greg.
So let's talk about some other strategies that are available to you under the levy limit law. So one strategy we'll talk about is kind of using the debt adjustment to kind of supplement your capital levy. And then the other option that's available is a levy limit referendum. And I'll just talk about both of these just to kind of give you some information on these tools and strategies that are available to you. So let's kind of talk about how you can supplement your capital levy. So I want to, make it clear that, in an ideal, scenario, you would, continue your practice that you're using, using your sinking funds, levying dollars for capital to avoid, borrowing for, as much of your capital assets as possible. So I want to make it clear that that is, the preferred way of doing things. But under levy limits, that can start becoming a challenge because, again, that capital levy is not exempt from levy limits. But general obligation debt is. And so, not all debt has to be long-term in nature. When you borrow money for items, you don't necessarily have to repay it over 5 years, 10 years, 15 or 20 years. You can repay debt in a shorter period of time. So what, some communities have started to do is, they would, prefer to levy tax dollars, and in this example, I'm just using squad cars, plow trucks, staff vehicles, typical things you would like to levy and pay cash for. If you can't fit that under your allowable levy, under levy limits, you could borrow for those items, but again, that doesn't mean you have to borrow for them over the long term. What you could do is borrow for them with a debt instrument that's, legally outstanding for, a year and 1 day, so it's considered long-term debt. But then, so it's exempt from levy limits, but then when you start your next budget year and you enter your property tax collections at the beginning of the year, you can pay that debt obligation off early. So I kind of call it near cash financing. You're not literally just paying cash. You are incurring some interest expense, but it may only be interest expense for a couple of months. So it's a way to, try to, get as close to levying a true flat-out dollar amount for that capital. You're converting it to debt, so it's exempt from levy limits, but you're not incurring interest expense over multiple years. So it's a strategy that's available, to you to kind of help, mitigate that. So in this example, if you finance $385,000 of projects and that was outstanding for 90 days and at 2.5%, you'd pay about $2,400 in interest. So that's the cost of using this technique, but it's exempting that from levy limits, so that's no longer have to fit it under your cap. So, if you do utilize this, I'm not going to bore you with the accounting considerations of this, but it is kind of important that that debt obligation kind of be issued in the right way. The term, like I said, be at least a year and a day, so it's considered long-term debt. It's just how it's reported on your financial statements. So just things to kind of coordinate if you use this strategy. So the other primary strategy that's available is levy limits. And so here on this chart, you see the number of levy limits that have passed in Wisconsin from 2011 through 2020. And so you can see over the last couple of years, there's been a larger uptick in the number of levy limit referendums. And as I mentioned earlier, I think that's largely due to just kind of 17 years of the cumulative impact of levy limits. We work with a lot of communities around Wisconsin, several hundred, and they're all varying sizes. And, some communities have been able to successfully manage, levy limits. Other communities, their allowable levy is only being increased by maybe $20,000 a year. That doesn't get you very far, particularly in today's environment. So you're seeing more communities look at levy limits. So kind of one of the policy decisions, if you go about doing a levy limit referendum, what are some of the things that, need to be kind of discussed from a high-level policy context? So if you put forth a levy limit referendum, in the question, you have to state, is it a kind of a one-time levy limit adjustment? It's for the upcoming budget year, so it impacts that next fiscal year, and then, you can no longer claim that adjustment as an allowable levy increase. Are you going to state it's for a number of years that levy limit adjustment will be in effect? Or is it going to essentially be ongoing, be permanent, that you want to retain that ability to increase your allowable levy each year to cover to that dollar amount that you specify? You also must state, what the purpose is for the levy limit increase. That can be as specific or as broad as, you determine is appropriate. It can be something very specific for a particular service, or it can be, broad-based and kind of cover, general operations and all services within the city. We've worked with several communities on levy limit referendums at Ellers, and I think I'm speaking in general terms, a common theme that we see is that there's typically costs in a particular area that are driving up, and putting budget pressures, on a community and their levy limit. That's resulting in the community making cuts in other areas. So when if they're going to do a levy limit referendum, if the bulk of their costs are in one area, but they've made cuts in other areas, do they want to restore that funding to some of those other areas where they've made the cuts? So then you'd want a broader question. Or if you think it's primarily related to a particular area, you can be pretty specific in terms of the type of service. So there's really no right or wrong answer to that question. It's unique to each community, but they are requirements when you kind of put those questions together. So I think, in terms of the timeline, there's deadlines that have to be met in terms of submitting questions, to the county clerk's office to get on ballots. Typically recommend, some public education in terms of the need for the levy limit increase, be able to articulate what that impact's going to be to a typical homeowner. Because in my opinion, when you put the levy limit question on the ballot, there's specific language that has to be included in that. That's a requirement. It is not a user-friendly question, in my opinion. It's basically a narrative description of math on a levy limit worksheet, which is as boring as it sounds. So, but that is how the question has to be written. And so, no disrespect to any voters anywhere, but, if you hand someone that question, they're just going to, likely scratch their head. So that it's helpful to kind of put that into a more meaningful context because, the question has to be written the way it needs to be written. But there's some benefit to kind of providing some more user-friendly information for electors. So that's kind of the overview, kind of the multi-year plan. I think in summary, the city, continues to do a lot well with its overall fiscal management. Again, recognized by Moody's in terms of your good, strong budget practices, healthy fund balance. The city's seen some, positive growth, in economic development over the years. You're starting to see the benefits of the closures of, two of your longest and largest tax incremental districts over the next 2 years. So that's, providing some nice potential relief within your budget. But in terms of some of the challenges, your challenges are similar to what other communities are facing, primarily that levy limit gap and continuing to strike that balance with providing the services that I know the city takes a lot of pride in, that you provide your residents and your businesses, maintaining that investment in your infrastructure and being able to, do so in a way that's affordable to taxpayers, but also allowable under the levy limit laws. So, I think there's, you've done a good job of kind of managing these challenges. As I said, it really kind of comes down to, despite every best efforts, can it be sustainable over the long term? So with that, I appreciate the questions you've asked thus far. I'll be happy to take more.
Alder Gerhart, go ahead.
I hope this one is quick. I just missed it when you were listing out the different revenue sources. So the ARPA and TID funding, that influx of money was taken into account for over the next several years?
I think for your ARPA funding, I think that's largely been kind of identified for capital investment. So in terms of your broader CIP, yes, that's been taken into account. So I mean, those projects that we showed as being debt financed were really just the projects, once all those other revenue sources were exhausted, you're kind of looking at what was identified for borrowing. In terms of the TIG closure, it's anticipated you'll get your proportional share of some payout of the remaining funds, and in the CIP there were specific projects listed that would be funded from some of that cash that is paid out. And Misty, you can correct if I've misstated anything.
Nope, that's exactly right. And so the council has been really good about applying that to one-time things, so that has been accounted in here, but there's not the impact going forward because we kept it one time.
Got it.
Yeah, and that's a good strategy because those are obviously revenue sources that you're not, collecting on a routine basis. So using it for capital is recognized as a good financial strategy and is largely what everyone does with those funds, particularly ARPA.
Okay, additional questions? Hearing none. Greg, thank you very much for your presentation this
You're welcome. Thank you all.
Thank you. All right, very good. We will move on to the next item on our agenda, and that is the Resource Conservation Committee update. And Ron French, you're presenting, and I'll let you introduce your team. So,
program pulled up here.
okay, all right.
Great, great. Well, thank you for giving us this opportunity to speak with the council members today and alders persons. We appreciate this opportunity, and today I'll be speaking along with Diane Streck, who's part of the commission, and Chris Jimison. They're both commissioners on the Resource Conservation Committee, and we look forward to sharing with you what we do as a commission. I know some of you are probably familiar with us, but some of you new alder persons may not know much about us. So hopefully tonight we will be able to share some of the things that we've been doing over the last couple of years and in the last year, and also what we plan to do for the next coming years. The discussion will be divided up here among us. I'll talk about the first set of the slides, then Chris will kick in, and then Diane, and I'll do a kind of a summary. So again, like I talked about today, is to share information about who we are, what we do, and to discuss our resource conservation, sustainability programs, and how they best fit to serve the city of Fitchburg. Also, we want to make sure that we're going in the right direction. We create some alignment between the council and RCC for future work that we're doing and things that we may have planned. Anytime during this presentation you have any questions, please feel free to ask. So this is our responsibilities. I got to move this out of the way here. The RCC recommends policy, enforcement, and enforcement programs that promote the general preservation and the improvement of the environment, including but not limited to stormwater, waste material, energy efficiency, and climate protection. So that's the things that we're responsible of doing. Again, this is the commission members. You've met Diane over here and Chris over here. I'm the chairperson. I'm a biologist. Diane's background, she's in accounting. Chris is a geological engineer and hydrogeologist. Kim Wardkin, she's on our commission as well. She's an operation manager, youth and education director at Wisconsin Land and Water Conservation Association. Joshua is one of our newer members. He's a medical education and grant specialist. Bill Booth is as a physical therapist. He's our brand new member that's on the commission. The commission is composed of an alder, and that's Gabriella. And then we have two city staff members, the new hire engineer, environmental engineer, Ben Schulte, and then we also have Phil Gruppe, who's our sustainability specialist. for the city. So you can see that the commission is composed of a variety of background of people, but a lot of us have an environmental focus. So some of the RCC goals that we want to accomplish in 2022, and we'll talk a little bit more about these in detail as we go through the presentation. One is to reduce light pollution. That is, we want to kind of reduce the amount of light that's coming out of the city of Fitchburg. If you look over the last 10 to 15, 20 years, as Madison has grown, as the city of Fitchburg has grown, the amount of light coming out and getting into our sky is increasing. So what we'd like to do are to find ways that we can reduce that light pollution, at the same time reducing costs to the city. Also, we want to progress towards completing the sustainability plan for the city. Diane will talk about that in a little bit. Equitable tree plantings, if you're not familiar with that, that's making sure that when we put new trees out in the city, that they're in all neighborhoods, not just located in certain neighborhoods where trees will be going. We want to make sure everybody has that opportunity to get new trees in their neighborhood. Do community outreach on various topics. This includes invasive species, the plastic bag reduction. We just recently completed an invasive species workshop that we had out at McGaw Park, and so it was very successful, and we like to continue doing those to keep the citizens of Fitchburg educated on what we're doing and what they can do to help make this a better place to live. And also to continue our work on waste reduction and recycling, water quality, renewable energy, and emissions reductions. So with regard to water quality, which is my background, is that last couple of years, we established a monitoring station on Swan Creek. Swan Creek is a tributary that flows through the city of Fitchburg and flows into Lake Wabisa. Before it hits Lake Wabisa, it flows into Wabisa wetlands, which is actually a very pristine area designated by Wisconsin DNR for protection. So we want to make sure that the water quality that's coming from and flowing off the land in the city of Fitchburg, you know, what is it composed of? Is it hurting the wetlands? Is it hurting the Lake Wabisa? So we wanted to make sure what was in that water. So a couple of years ago, USGS established a monitoring station on the creek. The city of Fitchburg is a partner with USGS, along with the town of Dunn and the Lake Wabisa Conservation Association and the Friends of Wabisa Wetlands. Each of these organization has contributed funding to help fund this station. So far, the station's been operating great for 2 years, and hopefully data will be coming in soon where we can evaluate the impacts of the stormwater flowing out of Fitchburg and the Swan Creek watershed. The Swan Creek watershed right now is getting a lot of growth in it in terms of residential and commercial development. So we want to make sure that the stormwater programs that the city has implemented are working, and we can tell by that by looking at the specific water quality parameters, such as total suspended solids, conductivity, are we getting more salt coming in, runoff of salt going into the creek? So we can be able to measure those parameters with this station.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to make a quick comment because Ron actually does the actual, correct me if I'm wrong, but you actually go out to the station
Well, yeah,
regularly and
we'll
do
go
the
out to
sampling.
USGS and retrieve the samples for them, yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
Ron's a regular volunteer doing that all over the region, but also at Swan Creek.
With that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Chris.
All right, well, thanks, Ron. So Ron was very integral in that Swan Creek monitoring station, making that a reality. And I think it's going to be some really good data that we can look at in Fitchburg and just kind of see how the stormwater is impacting things. And, you know, I think that we do have good policies in place right now. And I'm very interested to see how that data comes through and over time, how that's changing with the increasing population that we do have in that part of Fitchburg. So what I'm going to talk about, I've been on the RCC for back to 2008 is when I started. I had a couple-year break after adopting my son. But since 2010, I've stayed on and been part of community outreach on sustainability for Fitchburg. So I've been the chair of that committee, on point with most of the events that we do on outreach on sustainability in the community. And it's been a lot of fun to do it, to bring a lot of variety and different sustainability programs forward to the community for education and just understanding, you know, how people can be more sustainable and make Fitchburg a better community. So some of the things that we do are different educational events. A couple of events that we've had more recently in 2021, we had a tree diversity tour over at Quarry Hill Park. And then most recently, in June of 2022, earlier this month, we had an invasive species event at McGaw Park. And so these were our annual events, so we try to do an annual event each year. But in addition to that, when we get back to clicking at the rate we were prior to COVID, we try to have more like quarterly events. I would say we'd have 4 to 6 events per year. We use the library. We also try to move to different places around town, so we're not focused in one area. We've done a lot of educational events at grocery stores on reusable bags, so we now don't have as many plastic bags. Going back to Hy-Vee, when we started doing some of our reusable bag events, they were talking to us about how many plastic bags go out of the Hy-Vee in Fitchburg every week, and it was like an astronomical number, like 21,000 to 23,000 bags. Plastic bags are going out of that Hy-Vee in Fitchburg at a pop of 4 cents per bag, and you just kind of add up that expense, and we're like, well, if we could all just bring reusable bags and keep our costs down, that's a cost that the grocery store wouldn't have to have. And so that's one of the reasons that we, have done that event several times. It really doesn't take too much for us to put one of those on. We have a couple of boards that we show, and we normally the grocery store will put on an incentive. Obviously it's an incentive to them to have more of their shoppers coming in and not using their plastic bags, but using their own reusable bags. That did take a little bit of a downturn in the first part of COVID with touching things when that was a big part of it. And so, but they have worked back to where people can take their reusable bags in. So we want to continue and get people encouraged to go back into the stores with reusable bags. The other thing that people have probably seen a lot and is a very popular event that we have are the Shred, E-Cycle, and Med Drop events. So we have those a couple times a year. We did have a big break during the COVID stretch and had our first event last October, which was very popular. Just a ton of electronic recyclables. Those lines were very busy. And then even the paper shredding, people had a lot of times to sort through things at their homes. And so we had quite a bit of stuff. But I want to just thank our alders, Arada and Gerhardt and Wheeler, for participating in this year's event. With your help, we had 3 tons of paper, 7.8 tons of electronics, and over 70 pounds of meds that were dropped off during our April event. So
I think next year I'll do traffic direction. I kind of hurt from the 3 tons of paper. Not that I did it all myself.
Yeah.
But.
Yeah, traffic is always a tough thing to navigate. We're trying to keep people off of Lacey Road, and so that's always a challenge. We have some ideas, and we try to make little tweaks and add a little signage every time, and so hopefully with each time we're getting a little better with that. And then, yeah, like we said, we had a lot of even more electronics back in November of 2021, which you can see on the slide. Next slide, please.
Yeah, I'd just like to add also that during these educational events that we have, that Chris and his team have done a great job getting local sponsors to provide pizza, water, all kinds of different things that we can give away during these events. So I think it really attracts a lot of people, but also gets our community involved as well.
All right. One of the other things that we're getting into a little bit more this year is reducing light pollution. So this is an idea that Ron brought to the commission. It was something that we really hadn't gotten too much into before. I think back in 2016, 2017, we were working with a sustainability specialist at that time that was able to secure some grants to help with LED streetlights within Fitchburg. But this is a relatively new concept, but I think a very good one. So we've been getting educated by Ron on it, and I think right now we're going to kind of focus on getting educated and then starting to do some community outreach. So one of the things that we do as a commission, if you're reading the Fitchburg Star, you probably notice that we have several articles, and so we commit to, is it 9 articles per year? 9 articles per year that are written by the commissioners. And we have in the 10-plus years that we've been doing these articles, we've never run short on topics. So sustainability is the ever-giving topic for us to write about and provide information out to people in the community and tips for them to be more sustainable as well. So this is one that we're just taking on now, learning about. I would say that we'll maybe try to have an article coming out, but maybe something that we have a future event on in the future, potentially invite a speaker in to talk more about it as we want to educate more people in the community about it. But I think from having Phil participating from the city side of things, I think we would like him just to be educated about it with opportunities with our capital projects to consider this as well. Next slide.
Yeah, the city of Madison and city of Verona, they've also adopted some type of ordinances to reduce light pollutions in their area.
Another community event that we do each year is we lead annual waterway cleanup around Fitchburg in April. And so we do this at a bunch of different areas across Fitchburg. So Swan Creek of Nine Springs, Quarry Hill, Yarmouth Greenway, and Dunn's Marsh neighborhoods. We go out and we collect as many bags of garbage and recyclables as we can. And I personally lead the one in Swan Creek. The mayor and myself cleaned up a stretch along Cyene Road. And we have grown this event over time. So we've I want to say, branded it in Swan Creek. As I remember the first couple of years of doing this, I did it by myself. But in recent years, the last 3 or 4 years, we've had 20 to 35 people helping out and cleaning up essentially that whole corridor all the way out to as far as Highway 14 from Swan Creek and up all the way to almost the grounds of Promega. So we are covering a large area and trying to really clean up, and it's very wonderful to see things go from a state of very dirty at the end of winter to driving down those roads and not seeing any trash, at least for a couple days, until we see a bag of somebody's fast food thrown out the window, which is always frustrating. But we do, even in Swan Creek, I mean, we've netted as much as 40 bags of trash that we've picked up and picked that up in close proximity to our waterways, which has kept all that trash from going into our waterways, which I think is important. Next slide. And then we have what we've been doing at Aldo Leopold Elementary School. So some of you may have been around for the February 2020 presentation where we talked about this. But for the new council members, I just want to kind of go over some of the highlights of this program. And so it really goes back to 2015, 2016, even when Rick Eilertson was around in the city of Fitchburg. We would go out to Aldo Leopold School and we would do what was called a trash relay. So we would work with the students on what is considered trash versus what is recyclable, which is what is a compostable item, and just educate them on that. And then we would have a relay race between the different classes. So say we'd have the entire 5th grade, all the classes, they would all race against each other and try to do the best they could with the relay. Ultimately, what we were working towards was trying to get a recycling program going in their cafeteria. And so we talked with the custodial staff, we talked with the leadership, we talked with teachers and the students. They all wanted to make this happen. And we found out from the custodial team that there were about 60 bags of trash per day that were coming out of the cafeteria in a 2-hour session. So there's about 700 students. So 60 bags of trash is like 4 trips for a custodial member to take it out to their trash container during that 2-hour period. And so we said, well, let's try just recycling the cartons and stacking your trays and see if that will reduce your waste and improve your recycling. And much to the surprise of even us doing this, they were down to 15 bags on 2 consecutive days of waste. So I started to do the math in my head of 45 bags of trash not going into our containers per day for that school alone, and you're adding up to that being over 8,000 bags of trash that are kept out of the landfill each year just by being a little bit smarter with how we're handling our waste in one cafeteria at one school. And so it's kind of sparked kind of a whole program across the Madison School District at this point, where they have made the commitment where they want to try to get this recycling program going in all 33 of the Madison elementary schools this coming fall. And so I think pretty proud that that happened here and started in Fitchburg. Some of the things that we're figuring out during the pandemic, where kids aren't necessarily in the cafeteria but in their classrooms, were things that we were already working on to try to cover breakfast in the cafeteria or in the classrooms and trying to capture those milk cartons from breakfast. And so we were a little bit ahead of the pandemic in that regard, and some of that data that we're gathering from that is being used nationally to help programs where other schools are having that same struggle of having their meals in the classroom. So with that, I'll pass it over to Diane.
Little segue, that cafeteria recycling program, I think, is one of the neatest things that this commission has been involved in. And I think it's a nice collaboration between the school district and RCC. It's just very rewarding to see the support that the staff has given, and even the kids, when they come up and say, is this recyclable? I mean, it's just really neat. And our hope is not only to have that in the cafeteria, but the kids take the recycling idea home and they start recycling at home, and that increases in the community. RCC members, were switching gears a little bit. We're delighted when the council included funding in this year's operating budget for a sustainability plan. RCC has been working on different environmental and different sustainability things for years, but it's sort of been a hodgepodge, and a sustainability plan will allow us and the city to do things cohesively and strategically. The sustainability plan is a cohesive guidebook documenting Fitchburg's goals and Fitchburg's principles. Fitchburg has several sustainability commitments, which I'll talk about in a minute, but this sustainability plan will provide a roadmap for achieving those and a way to measure our progress against those. You all have our slides, so I'm not going to go through everything that's on the slide. I'm just going to hit a few highlights, but bringing that all together and providing the roadmap and being able to measure progress, I think, will be really beneficial for Fitchburg. Some of Fitchburg's commitments include, going way back to 2008, the U.S. Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement. I think that might predate everybody that's an alder now. And that, the U.S. Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement, which Fitchburg signed on to, was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 7% from levels of, 1990 levels. Now, for Fitchburg, we did a greenhouse gas inventory. Actually, I did it, and I know that we didn't have records that we could go back and determine our greenhouse gas emissions. So we just took the baseline that we could and started working forward with plans of ways that we could reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I won't say that we didn't run into some roadblocks and some obstacles, but I'm very happy to see that our current council is very supportive of reducing our emissions. The next thing that the city did was sign on to the 25 by 25 State of Wisconsin Clean Energy Pledge, which is to generate 25% of our electricity and transportation fuels from renewable sources by 2025. I think Phil, our sustainability staff member, is giving or will give council an update on where we stand on that. So we didn't include signs or slides for that. I will point out that this is just electricity and transportation fuels. It doesn't include gas, so it doesn't include natural gas heating. And most recently, and I think many of you were a part of this, we have the Clean Energy Resolution, which is setting a goal to meet 100% of the city's electricity needs through renewable sources by 2030. There are other things in that initiative. There are other things in the 25 by 25 pledge, but I think these are the highlights. So the sustainability plan should bring all of that together and give us a way that we can meet these and hopefully exceed these goals. Next slide, please. These are the common elements in a sustainability plan. Many of them, you'll see the items, some of the items have something in parentheses that refers to plans that Fitchburg already has in place. Like the comprehensive plan is CP, the bike and ped plan is BPP, the HNI is Healthy Neighborhoods Initiative. So Fitchburg has been working on the elements that make a sustainability plan for a number of years. They just haven't been pulled together in a cohesive plan. If you look at the last item on that list, we don't have a plan for water or waste, and we're hoping that the consultant that we hire to do the sustainability plan will come up with suggestions for that. Next slide, please. We envision the sustainability plan for Fitchburg will encompass municipal operations initially, and then the community. The community plan would define needed actions and the ways for achieving them, but it's not, I want to stress this, we're not requiring anybody to do anything. We're requesting change by community members. We're requesting behavior changes, much like we do, like our idling reduction campaign. We want people to limit their voluntary idling. The likely inclusions in the community plan would be transportation, energy efficiency, conservation and renewables, recycling and waste reduction, and we are continually doing events and writing articles to get people to recycle more and reduce their waste. As if you've read the STAR, you'll see that. And water management. Water management is an area that we don't really have, the city doesn't really have a plan. Oh, yes.
Go ahead.
I don't ask this question now.
That's fine.
Have you considered, you will consider in this sustainability plan also housing, you know, how we can be sustainable when we develop housing or projects on using, you know, sustainable materials, and have you considered to include that in the plan too? Because I know that there are a lot of municipalities in this country that they are applying some, when the new neighborhood is built, there are some requirements of,
Like a lead
components of material that are, you know, renewables in the construction and all of that. I don't know, I am thinking.
I think that's up to the council and staff if they would like to do that. I know that this commission talked about like a lead gold star or platinum, you know, like the library is lead platinum, I think. We've talked about doing that as a commission. At the time, the city wasn't really ready to go beyond municipal operations, but if the city is in agreement and they want that to be to go beyond municipal operations, I think that's up to the alders. Is that something? I mean, are you ready to give an opinion on that? Maybe I shouldn't throw you under like that. I won't put that pressure on you.
I am curious because it's about. And see that is you're focused more internally.
Yes.
You know, but I am thinking about eventually we will need to start talking about this. You know, about if we want to be sustainable as a city, also we need to be sustainable of how the new project and development that come to the city, they are following our vision. You know what I mean? So
I totally agree. Yes, I agree. You're right. The initial focus will be on municipal operations. The next part is in the community part, and that goes right to this next slide.
Before we move on, we have an additional question.
Sorry.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to say that I think at minimum, hopefully that we can identify areas of sustainability plan that could be expanded, you know, at the end of the plan, even if we can't encapsulate everything. Hopefully there are elements that exist in other people's plans and other municipalities that we should kind of a wish list of future things that we could look at.
Okay.
Very good. Go.
For the municipal operations, this is the items on the left. Those are the individuals or bodies that we envision being involved in developing the sustainability plan for municipal operations. The items on the right would be for the community, to develop a plan for the community where we would actually get community members involved, get their feedback, get their input. It would involve several meetings with the community, which the community plan, you can go to the next slide, please, Ron. Community plan will take significantly longer than the municipal operations, partly because many of the things, like I said, we've got a bike and ped plan, we've got Healthy Neighborhoods Initiative. A lot of the municipal part is already done. It needs to be pulled together. But the community, we really don't have, that's kind of starting from scratch. So in the operating budget for this year, you provided $25,000, which we think will cover the municipal sustainability plan. We don't think that that will be enough to cover the community plan. The RFP hasn't gone out yet. We can kind of see what comes back, and obviously we'll stretch the dollars as far as we can. But the community sustainability plan involves quite a few more meetings, so quite a bit more work. We don't think the $25,000 will cover that. We do hope that the municipal plan could be done in 6 to 9 months. Because of staffing issues, like I said, the RFP hasn't gone out yet. It's not even ready to go out yet. But hopefully once the RFP goes out and a consultant is picked, we'll have a municipal plan within 6 to 9 months. Community plan, we expect, might take beyond that 18 to 24 months. Are there any questions? Again, I want to thank you for your support of the sustainability plan. We have hoped for this for, it seems like, a decade. So we're just delighted that it's going to be realized.
Yes, Alder Gerhart.
I do have a quick question, and you might not have the answer, but I was pleased that the mayor included this in your ARPA TID plan for potential additional funding. Do you have a sense of the scale of your anticipated additional contribution? Was it another $25,000? Or I know that some of those categories were just broad, like general ideas, but I was wondering if you had a perspective on that.
I guess we don't necessarily have a dollar amount at this point in time. I think that's one of those things that I guess would be more collaborative with the council to find out. I don't know what a community one would cost. Is it $50,000 or is it $100,000? Because that is an impact as well. As you know, we're $2 million spent over what we have available, so that's also an issue as well. So there's not necessarily a dollar amount at this point in time dedicated towards it. I think it's juggling it like everything else. It's a juggling act with everything.
Alder Herbst.
Hydrologist here. I've been on board Public Works for almost 30 years with the water system. Concern of mine has always been, we have deep wells and we're pumping the water out of there. That, the water that we're using isn't going back into our same watershed. Okay. Are there options? All I've ever heard of is injection wells, which they do in California, which is pretty extreme. Are there solutions? When we talk about sustainability, I'd like us to be, the water that we take out, we find some way to keep in our local aquifer. If that's even reasonable, I don't know. I'm not a hydrologist, so.
Yeah, I think, kind of starting at the individual homeowners level, doing rain gardens is a good start. Bigger picture, we had recently, I'd recently written an article in the Fitchburg Star earlier this month and kind of dug into, some older information. I was pleasantly surprised to see that our actual water usage in the Madison area has gone down substantially. So I just participated in a course that Sustained Dane put on and learned that our water usage in the greater Madison area has gone down in recent years, and we are, lining up better with recharging our aquifers. So I'm encouraged by that. So I think, continuing to practice water conservation and see what we can do there. We want to protect, I'm always skeptical about injection. I think we have a very good water source right now. I think, some of the keys, when we talk with MMSD are, a couple of key things. So chlorides. So chlorides are a big thing. That's something that we have to deal with at the municipal level in terms of putting salt on roads and always looking for solutions to try to keep that down. It's a tough one to manage. We want, our roads to be safe. But at the same time, looking for opportunities to use as minimal salt as possible. Do we really need to use salt for this snow event is one thing. And then educating our residents to not be throwing heaps of salt when really they don't need to spread that much out to do the job in terms of, salting their sidewalks or driveways. Again, we want to use enough to be safe, but not too much that it's, you have this thick residue, and we've all seen it, on sidewalks that we're grinding over and picking up on our shoes and then taking back into our homes. The other component that MMSD is pretty big on is phosphorus. So, limiting, phosphorus in our fertilizers, that has been, most of our fertilizers in Dane County are phosphorus free. But, just kind of that runoff is kind of what turns our waterways green. And so limiting that phosphorus going in as well, so that water, that chloride and, all the phosphorus that is going back into our waterways and eventually in some cases infiltrating back in, we're trying to limit that as much going back into our aquifer as we can. Anybody have anything to add to that?
Water is one of the items that Fitchburg doesn't have a plan for, like the bike and ped plan. And that's one thing that we have included in the sustainability plan, that we want that included.
We have a very competent engineer that manages that. I think you know that. That we the model for where our water is coming from at our wells. We're not just winging it. I hope you don't.
Right. Right.
But thank you for taking that up. Appreciate it.
Additional questions or comments?
Make a comment?
Yes.
No, I want to thank you for all the work that you do, guys. I think Gabriela's always report to the council, and it seems that you have a lot of fun in that committee. So thank you very much for everything that you do for the city. So.
Thanks.
Appreciate
Well,
your
thank you.
time.
Yeah,
We just have 2 more slides and we're wrapping.
Oh, you do? Okay, very good. Go ahead. Go ahead.
All right, so what are the benefits to the citizens of Fitchburg from this commission? Well, as you listen today and as we've shown to you, there's a lot of things. These bullets kind of identify those things, but the recycling event it's a very popular event. And as you can see, we have recycled a lot of materials, paper, metal, meds, all kinds of things. So it's a very popular one. When I'm standing out there pulling all that paper out of the people's cars for shredding, they all say, thank you. We really appreciate the services that you're providing to us. So it's well received in the community. And, we're monitoring what we're doing in terms of the watershed, making sure we're not contaminating any of the wetlands and the lakes that the Swan Creek flows into. And, we're also providing educational events for people to get out. The invasive species event that we had a couple of weeks ago, over 40 people attended, which was amazing. Although I think the pizza brought them out, but it was nice to have everybody there. It was a large crowd. And then also, the newspaper articles, the 9 that we do every year, it educates the citizens on what we do for those people that read the Fitchburg Star. So we do a lot, and I think it provides a lot of benefit to our citizens. And just to summarize, what we've been doing, the projects, these are the things that we will continue to focus on. They're things that we will do on an annual basis, and every now and then something will come up, like reducing the light pollution or something else that we might want to look at and pursue. And so, but again, these are the things that we will be doing as we move forward. And with that, I got some kind of questions. I want to make sure you kind of agree with the folks of where we're heading, that we're providing a good benefit to the city. So,
How often do you meet?
We meet
Once a month or-
once a month.
It was recently increased, thanks to Gabriella's efforts, to 10 times a year.
Thank you.
Additional comments? Questions? Hearing none.
I have a question. I'm sorry.
Late.
I have to stop saying hearing none. I just, or that, maybe that's the key.
Yeah, can I go? Okay. So, when the program that you have at Leopold School, have you thought to duplicate that program in other school districts in Fitchburg, like Oregon or Verona?
Yeah, so I think, we've thought about getting into Stoner Prairie and talked about, doing that. And, I think that's, there's been so much effort and hours that 3 of our commissioners have put into it. I mean, we've literally put hundreds of hours of monitoring that. But we're really trying to figure out, we really kind of go back to Leopold as our kind of our pilot school. And, it's kind of a pilot school for this Madison School District as well. But our hopes are to, eventually get back and spread it back out to other schools that are within Fitchburg or schools that Fitchburg residents go to.
We had a little bit of a setback because of the pandemic, and so we had to readjust because they're eating in the classroom now instead of the cafeteria. But Chris has had other schools, people from other schools approach him and copy that. So I think there's somebody in the Girl Scouts in Cottage Grove adopted the program that he's put together, and a mother from another Madison school contacted us to see what we were doing and how she could bring that to her school. So it's spreading. We just haven't been able to spread it around Fitchburg yet.
Go ahead, Dave.
Advice, down the street from my house, I look in the neighbors, the apartments, the recycling bins, and they're just using them as a second garbage can. So that I'm looking for help. I'm looking for help or suggestions. I'm not sure there's much I can do. I'm just happy it's not on the ground.
Yeah.
But any thoughts? Email me. It's I think you're going to say education, and but any thoughts? Please email them to me.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's definitely been a pain point, and it has when we had Kia was on our commission. She was really focused in that area, and I think that's an area that we still have a passion for and want to get back into working with the multifamily residents around Fitchburg. I know myself, I pulled in late August into an apartment complex and got a got a close-up view of a trash receptacle and recyclable and said, oh my gosh, we got to get back to work on this. It is education. I go back to an event. So we used to have events where we go out to multifamily complexes and do educational events on what you can recycle and try to talk to the landlords. One of the things that we were trying to kick off right at about the time of the pandemic was trying to get into talking with more landlords and trying to help them manage this a little bit better. Making sure that they have enough receptacles. One of the big things for multifamily residents is to have, close receptacles, make it easy for them to recycle. And, I think, if it's easier to just take it down to the trash, or if they don't have the setup in their individual apartments to take down a recycling bin and put that in the recyclable, whatever those roadblocks are, I think need to be looked at a little bit more closely and try to figure out. So I think there is educational, both from the residents, but also I think working with the landlords to make it easier for the residents. And that is an initiative that we would love to pick back up at some point.
Keep me in mind.
All right.
Very good. Thank you very much, Ron, Diane,
Thank you.
and Chris. We will move on to item 7, announcements. The next committee of the whole meeting is scheduled for July 27th, 2022. And then item 8, adjournment. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
We have a second, and those in, is there There's no discussion. Those in favor of adjournment, say aye.
Aye.
The ayes have it. Motion carries. We are adjourned. It's 8:49 PM.